This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. Despite loving all things Southwest, especially the desperados, lawmen, and bad guys, and despite living in New Mexico, I knew very little about Billy the Kid prior to reading and researching and visiting the places of this story for this series. But on account of recent events in my life, I grew very interested in the young gunfighter immediately after I published my last episode over the Anasazi. So I dove very deep into his life and the Lincoln County War that surrounded so much of it. Obviously, before I began this series, I rewatched Young Guns, and while fun, it is almost entirely fiction. Like completely fiction, really. Even Tunstall's age, the late great Terrence Stamp was 50 years old when he played the 25-year-old fun and brotherly, not fatherly, Tunstall. But this series isn't a debunking of the film, and I don't think I'll mention it again over the next 11 episodes. So, without any further ado, let's ride into the life of Henry McCarty, a.k.a. William Antrim, a.k.a. William H. Bonney, a.k.a. Billy the Kid. In 1846, 17-year-old Catherine McCarty boarded a ship in Ireland for the United States of America. The famine hadn't hit yet. Instead, she was one of many young women and men of Scottish or Irish or British descent who came to the States for the prospect of a better life. Many would start a business or a farm. Many more would head into the interior of the country, the Midwest, and start a family. Catherine was one of those women. She would start a business and a family, although she would not get married for quite some time. And unusual for the day, she had her first child while unmarried and at 31 years old. Henry McCarty was born in 1860, possibly 1859 as many sources claim. But Henry McCarty was born in Anderson, Indiana, not New York City, as so many other sources and authors claim. His father may or may not, I lean towards not, but his father may or may not have been the son of the local hotel owner, a man 13 years Catherine's junior. This man is named William Henry Harrison Antrim. He was named after the 9th president. A lot of people in this story are named after a president. William Antrim came home from the Civil War after his 3-month enlistment in 1863. He saw no combat, but his brother had died at Gettysburg, and he probably did not want to share in that same fate. Both William Antrim and his family, the hotel owners, and Catherine McCarty with her 2 sons, because she'd had another one by now. But she and her 2 sons, Henry and Joseph, with the Antrims, they would all move from Anderson to Indianapolis. Henry McCarty, as I mentioned earlier, will later go by his stepfather's name, Henry Antrim. He will then use the name William H. Bonney before finally being dubbed Billy the Kid. In 1870, William Antrim and Catherine McCarty, with her 2 sons, they all moved from that bustling city of Indianapolis to Wichita, Kansas. The two, Catherine and William, were not yet married. She was 40 by now, and he was 27. And again, I do not believe that William Antrim is Henry McCarty's father. In Wichita, Catherine McCarty started her own hand-washed laundry service. She'd been doing this kind of business probably since she landed in the States, and she had just continued doing that work after she headed towards the interior of the nation. Above the laundry service, she and her 2 boys lived in the building, while William Antrim built first his own cabin and then a home for Catherine and her 2 boys. The McCarty family would eventually move 15 miles outside of Wichita, and there they were surrounded by sunflowers, buffaloes, cattle traveling the Chisholm Trail, howling wolves, howling winds, and howling tornadoes. But the long daily journey to Wichita from its outskirts wasn't fit for the woman, who seemed to be coming down with a mysterious illness. So eventually she moved her and her 2 sons back into Wichita, and the 3 of them lived above the laundry yet again. It was 1871, and young Henry McCarty was around 10 years old. Only a few months later, though, Catherine up and sold everything she had in Wichita, and she was planning yet another move. She had apparently, as I just suggested, she had come down with a bad cough, night sweats, and she was losing weight. By this time, Catherine, the mother of Henry McCarty, she had come down with consumption, or TB, tuberculosis. No doubt on account of working for decades in the wet, damp, steamy laundry business. Back then, doctors knew just the cure, and that cure was to move to a high and dry climate like Colorado or New Mexico, and once there to take it easy. TB is caused by a bacterial infection that today is fixed almost instantly with antibiotics. But at the time, it would eventually prove fatal while withering the sufferer down. Think of Doc Holliday. Unfortunately, moving to a high and dry climate did not cure the disease, except for a very rare few, but it did help the symptoms, at least for a time. So off went the McCarty clan with William Antrim in tow, and they were headed to Santa Fe, New Mexico. They would arrive there in September of 1871, about a month after leaving Wichita. Now, I apologize to my Kansas listeners, but I have lived in the state, and I can't say I blame them. Consumption or no consumption, Kansas is a rough place that's cold, it's also hot, and always windy. Even more so than Oklahoma, which I spent 11 years in. I only tolerated Kansas for 3 months. I'm now going to read you a great description of Santa Fe from the author George R. Matthews, which comes from his brand new book, Billy the Kid, The Life Behind the Legend. It was released in February of 2025, and it is the best source. Quote, sitting at the southern end of the Rocky Mountains at slightly more than 7,000 feet in elevation, Santa Fe offered an ideal high, dry, and sunny climate for those suffering from tuberculosis. New Mexico's capital city, with around 5,000 residents, sat nestled among, quote, a sweep of red carmelian-colored hills lying at the foot of the Sangre de Cristo, Blood of Christ, mountains, end quote. At sunset, quote, all the low adobe houses were rose color in that light, a little darker in tone than the amphitheater of red hills behind, end quote. The Santa Fe River ran down from the mountains, through town, and beyond to the Rio Grande. In the fall of each year, the aspen groves, running between the dark stands of pine, brightened the mountains with swaths of gold. In a predominantly Spanish-speaking town, young Henry would soon become proficient in the language. End all quotes. So in that quote, Matthews, the author, was himself quoting Death Comes for the Archbishop, a novel by Willa Cather from 1927. The novel has stories about two people I've talked about a lot, Kit Carson and Manuel Chavez. I reckon I should read it one of these days. Back to the McCartys, though. On March 1st, 1873, the McCartys became the Antrums when the 43-year-old Catherine married the 30-year-old William at the First Presbyterian Church in Santa Fe. 12-year-old Henry McCarty then became Henry Antrim. The marriage was probably born out of love, but it was also prompted by Catherine's continual decline from consumption. But at least now the boys would have a stepfather to raise them once she passed on, inevitably. At least, that was Catherine's hope. Days after the wedding, the four of them boarded a stagecoach and traveled down the Rio Grande because they were once again on the move. Their journey mirrored the paths of the ancient ones, who regularly traveled to Mesoamerica for trading or to learn the mystery schools down south. It's the same path the Spanish took when they conquered New Mexico. It's the same path the Confederates took during their ill-fated invasion. Once the Antrums reached Mesilla, the once capital of the Confederate territory of Arizona, they turned westward on the dangerous and fraught with Apaches Butterfield Overland Mail Trail, which is something else I've talked about quite a bit. The Antrums' destination was Silver City, that booming town south of Pinos Altos. It was straight in the heart of Apacheria. While the Apaches had mostly been subdued by now, the threat of attack was still ever present, as listeners to my Apache series know. After all, Geronimo's escape has yet to occur. Moving to Silver City had twofold benefits. The first, William Antrim could possibly strike it rich in the many mines popping up around the new town. The second, Catherine could get further relief with her affliction, or so the people of the era believed. The Santa Fe Daily New Mexican wrote of Silver City on June 24, 1872, and said, quote, "Its altitude above the level of the sea is about 5,000 feet, and the town possesses a climate rendering it desirable as a place of resort for those who may be laboring under diseases tending to consumption or lung diseases. 25 miles to the southward are the famous hot springs now owned by the Misters Hudson and Lacey, which have become renowned from the relief its waters have given to persons affected with rheumatism and kindred diseases of a chronic nature." End quote. This is where the Indiana boy, the future Billy the Kid, would truly find his love and respect for the wild and woolly West. At this point, the town had 15 saloons, 3 dance halls, but not a single school or church. Although that would change shortly. The Antrums lived in a log cabin in town, and they owned 3 adjacent lots. Apparently, much like my home was in my youth, the Antrums' home was the center of activity for the kids in town. One of Henry's schoolmates would later say of Billy the Kid's home, quote, "From school each afternoon we made straight for the Antrim home to play. Miss Antrim always welcomed the boys with a smile and a joke, and made sure the cookie jar was never empty to the boys." End quote. And that pretty much sums up my mother and our home in Georgia. There was never a day when neighbors or friends or family weren't in and out of the open door, and there was nary a day that our friends' bellies weren't full of snacks and junk food. Catherine, at first, she seemed to get better, and she regularly attended the local dances where she could, quote, "dance the Highland fling as well as the best of the dancers," End quote. Now, I do not know what the Highland Fling is, but I reckon I could ask my wife. She, after all, was a competitive Irish dancer when she was a teenager. And although she's never showed me her talents, I believe she was rather good at kicking her heels. The Antrums arrived in March, and with the growing town, the residents realized the quote-unquote village Arabs, which is what they called the roaming youths. The town realized these Utes needed a school to house these idle ruffians who roamed the countryside and the town's streets. By September, Silver City would finally establish the town's first school. In January 1874, the boys were enrolled in this new school with about 30 other white kids. The New Mexican natives were not allowed. At 12 years old, Henry was, quote, only a small boy, small for his age and kind of skinny, end quote. Another of Henry's classmates described him as being, quote, undersized and really girlish looking. I don't think he weighed over 75 pounds, end quote. The kid part of Billy the Kid really starts to make sense as you read all the eyewitness descriptions of him. It seemed he never grew out of these characteristics either. At least he never got old enough to. Meanwhile, Joseph, Henry's brother, who was without a doubt his half-brother, even the Albuquerque Evening Review would later write that, Joseph McCarty, or Joseph Antrim now, he was stocky, taller, and he appeared older than Henry, who was 3 years Joseph's senior. William Antrim, he may have been Joseph's father, but who knows who Henry's real father was. Also in January of 1874, Catherine rented out one of her properties to a man named Marshall Ashman Upson. Ash Upson to his buddies. Ash was born in Connecticut in 1828. Mark Lee Gardner, in his very famous To Hell on a Fast Horse, The Untold Story of Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett, he describes Ash thusly, quote, Ash was a gregarious newspaperman who claimed he had once tutored the children of Mormon leader Brigham Young. He appeared to be constantly on the move, finding it difficult to remain in one place for very long. He also found it difficult to remain sober for very long, and to prove it, he had several battle scars, including a badly damaged nose, end quote. And this next sentence is actually why I'm bringing Ash up here. Gardner continues, quote, in one of those extraordinary coincidences that history often throws at us, Ash Upson eventually became Pat Garrett's best friend and the ghostwriter of Garrett's 1882 biography of Billy the Kid. End quote. Between semesters in 1874, Henry became a young actor as the children would put on plays to raise funds for the school the town was attempting to build. Gardner suggests that these plays were blackface minstrel shows, which were quite popular at the time. I'm not sure if that's true. Regardless, Henry became an appreciator of attention rather young in life. This love of attention would stay with him until his dramatic death at 21 by the guns of the just mentioned Pat Garrett. Around the town, though, some mischief turned into law-breaking. Money was stolen from the butcher's register. More money and whiskey were being taken from saloons. Trouble, it seems, was brewing in the hearts of the youths known as the village Arabs. And then, in the summer of 74, Henry himself devised a plan with another younger boy to steal jewelry And this jewelry was going to be auctioned off while the circus was in town. I remember when the circus used to come to town. My father loves the circus. I get him tickets almost every month. That's an inside joke. I reckon, though, this plan was actually devised by the other boy. As Billy the Kid would later in life say of his fellow thief, a kid known as Stevens, he would say he was, quote, a schemer, always trying to figure out some way of putting something over to get money, end quote. Apparently, they were going to steal the jewels and then run across the border to Juarez to sell the loot. After reading all the sources, this whole shenanigan seems like a pipe dream. It was a dream thought up by some bored boys during the excitement of the circus. Kind of like how I dreamed and planned to rob a bank in my youth. Okay, I was in my 20s. It never happened so. And that's also kind of what happened with Henry McCarty. Before the job, Stevens chickened out, and he told his father, who then told the jeweler. After the plan had been scrapped, Stevens blamed Henry. He said Henry McCarty, quote, had me hypnotized, end quote. Now, all the sources except Matthews say that Billy the Kid was the leader of these gangs and the future regulators, and he was a leader of the Billy Wilson gang, which you'll hear about a lot later. But Billy was never a leader. He never hypnotized anybody except maybe women, especially Hispanic women. So I think this is one of those quotes that comes down 30 years later and is a little embellished by the newspaper clippings and the dime novels that came out after Billy was killed by Pat Garrett. And there are a lot of quotes like that. I think I'll even mention that again soon. Now, don't get me wrong. Billy was charming, and he could charm the pants off of just about anyone. Again, or so the stories go. Because I am warning you, for most of the series, it's hard for me to believe a lot of the myths around the kid, especially if it isn't mentioned in Matthew's book. So it's possible Henry was a little thief, or an attempted thief. He certainly will be before too long. But it's also possible that this was just all kid stuff in a rough and tumble mining town far from civilization, where the kid had a sick mother and a stepfather, who wasn't really there. This probably would have not led to anything serious. I mean, everyone who ever met Billy told a story as soon as he became famous. Whether those stories are true or not are still up for debate. And that includes this failed jewel heist in Silver City during the circus. By the summer of '74, around the time of the failed jewel heist, Catherine had become bedridden with her affliction. And to make matters worse, like I just mentioned, William Antrim, the stepfather, had abandoned the family. He was off in Clifton, Arizona, trying his hand at mining, and also avoiding any responsibility in Silver City. The circus would eventually leave town, and school would start back up again. And they got a teacher for the town and the school. She had just arrived, but she had a tough time with the unruly lot, and in August, she up and quit, right there on the spot. It didn't help that after a heavy monsoon, the roof mud dropped on her and her student's head in the middle of a lecture. In September, Henry and Joseph's mother, Catherine, would sadly and finally succumb to her tuberculosis. That meant the boys were now without a mother. And their stepfather had leapt up out the territory. So they were without parents at all. Life had certainly presented some challenges to the young boys in one of the most wildest places in the nation at that time. After her death, Joseph and Henry were sent to live with the town butcher, a man named Richard Knight, and his wife Sarah. At the butcher shop, Henry seemed to have taken a liking to this new set of circumstances, or at least, he adapted quite well. He helped around the house and the butcher shop when he could, and when he wasn't doing chores, he was always reading. Henry McCarty loved books. He read a lot of dime novels and police stories, books and stories that would no doubt aid his future career, books and stories that would give him his most famous alias, and books and stories that would give him the name of the band of men he would set about striking blows in defense of justice with. After Catherine's death, William Antrim would indeed return to Silver City, and he too lived at the butcher shop, but only for a very short amount of time. By the end of 1974, he was already back in Arizona, but not before breaking up the boys and sending Joseph to a saloon and gambling joint owned by a Joe Dyer. 14-year-old Henry was sent to live with his mother's previous caretaker, and the owners of the local hotel. These were the Truesdells. And I do not know why William Antrim split the boys up. Doesn't seem right to me. Despite the boys no doubt working for their new families, the two still attended school. The new teacher, she was an Englishwoman named Mary Philippa Richards. It seems Henry took a real liking towards her too. They were, Henry and Mary, they were both ambidextrous, which you'll hear about once Henry starts holding guns instead of pencils. Miss Richards seems to have liked Henry and remarked how he was always helping with chores. She described him as, quote, a scrawny little fellow with delicate hands and an artistic nature, end quote. She also said that he was, quote, no more of a problem in school than any other boy growing up in a mining town, end quote. And I want to kind of dwell on this for just a second. Many stories and books and myths, they have Billy the Kid as the star of every scene that plays out in his life around him, especially during the Lincoln County War. It is quite possible that all the secondhand myths or stories told decades later by those who knew him or said they knew him or had a chance acquaintance with him, it's possible all of those anecdotes are true. But the more I studied Billy the Kid, the more I realized he really wasn't all that different from those around him. He was a kid when he was around kids. He was a cowhand amongst cowhands. He was a horse thief amongst bandits. He was a regulator amongst his comrades. He was an outlaw among thieves. He was likable and he adapted. He was rarely a leader, if ever, but rather he was always a strong partisan follower, true to his friends. He yearned to be loved or even just liked. And how can you blame him? No father, a stepfather that abandoned him, a sickly mother who was always working, and when she wasn't working, she was entertaining the town, either by dancing or by mothering everyone else. Billy's not without his faults, and he does become a killer. As you'll see, he becomes an outlaw, a desperado. But he became those things in order to fit in order to be a part of a family, and sometimes in order to survive. The future Lincoln County War truly shows that he was a righteous man that lost the path after every single odd available became stacked against him. But all right, enough editorializing. Despite Henry's seeming innocence, by 1875, the orphaned future Billy the Kid began to get into more trouble. His first real run-in with the law came in that spring when he stole, quote, several pounds of butter from a ranchman by the name of Webb, living near Silver City, and which he disposed of to one of the local merchants, end quote. That quote is from the then, in 1875, recently elected sheriff. He gave an interview about Billy the Kid in 1902. And this interview is a frequent source of information about Billy's early years. The 6'2" ex-minor sheriff's name is Harvey Whitehill. The sheriff apprehended the little thief, but he would let him go when Henry promised to never do wrong again. A promise he would very soon break. In that interview, 27 years later, a fact that is important, Whitehill would say of Henry that he had a, quote, peculiar facial characteristic that to an experienced manhunter would have marked him immediately as a bad man, and that was his dancing eyes. They never were at rest, but continually shifted and roved, much like his own rebellious nature. End quote. It's kind of doubtful that the old sheriff would remember that one detail almost 3 decades later, but maybe the kid left that much of an impression on him. After the theft of the butter, Henry was pawned off to a bartender and his wife, R.H. and Sarah Brown. Again, it can't help the future of a child if he's never had a real father figure, and then after his mother dies, he's just constantly passed around to different, indifferent, quote-unquote parents. While living with the Browns, Henry had to pay rent, so he began to work, most likely at the butcher shop. But he also had made money doing what he would be famous for later, playing poker and Monte. I had no clue what Monte was, but thankfully Matthews describes the game pretty well, so I'll just quote him now. Monte is like poker, except 3 cards are dealt face down to each player after everyone antes. Each player then has the option of betting or folding. Action begins with the player to the left of the dealer. When a bet is made, the next player must make a bet equal to that bet, or more, to stay in the game. Betting continues until only 2 players are left, the other players having folded. Either of the 2 remaining players doubles the previous bet to see the hand of their opponent. Both players show their cards, with the best hand winning the pot. Hand ranking follows the same sequence as 5-card poker, with the exception that a straight beats a flush in Monte, as a 3-card flush is more likely than a 3-card straight, while the opposite is true in 5-card poker. Another difference between Monte and poker is that after a hand of Monte, the cards are placed on the bottom of the deck and the next hand is dealt without shuffling. End quote. Sounds like a fun enough game, really. Another person who will feature heavily in this story also played a lot of cards, and he was also good at them. That man is the previously mentioned Sheriff and Deputy U.S. Marshal, Pat Garrett. Also living at the Browns' residence, which was kind of like a boarding house, but also living with Henry was a young man named George Schaefer. He would help, and not in a good way, shape the 15-year-old Henry. According to a boyhood friend of Henry's, Harry Whitehill, yes, the son of the sheriff, Harry said of George, quote, "This fella George liked to steal. He had a mania to steal, and he was always stealing." End quote. George would be nicknamed Sombrero Jack on account of, well, obviously the sombrero he always wore. The two, Henry and George, became fast friends, and before long, fast co-conspirators. Like I said, Henry liked to fit in with anyone who gave him the time of day, and George is one of those guys. In September of '75, George, aka Sombrero Jack, broke into the laundry business of some newly arrived Chinese immigrants. He would steal 2 pistols and hundreds of dollars of laundered clothing and blankets before bringing them back to the Browns' residence, where he was also living. Sombrero Jack then asked Henry to hide the goods in his room at the Browns, and Henry dutifully went along with it. He had a friend, and he wanted to keep that friend. Unfortunately, Sarah Brown found the stolen goods in Henry's room, and she told the sheriff, Harvey Whitehill. The sheriff probably regretted not punishing Henry earlier, but really, Henry wasn't the one who had stolen the goods. Regardless, Henry was arrested and put in the town's new jail. Whitehill's daughter would later say, quote, "Billy was the most surprised boy in the world when he landed in the jail. But he didn't stay there for long. He never did." End quote. As for Sombrero Jack, he'd already leapt up out of town. The next part of the story will be a repeated theme throughout Billy the Kid's life, as the sheriff's daughter hinted at. Despite the jail being sealed shut, Henry will not stay long within its confines. Here's a quote from the December 1873 edition of Silver City's Mining Life newspaper. The jail that is holding Henry was, quote, "one of the most substantial structures in the territory. It is very solidly built with fireplaces and good roof and doors, is well ventilated, and we are thoroughly satisfied that those who occupy it as criminals will wish that Hall, the builder, hadn't understood his biz so well." End quote. I like how very solidly built with fireplaces is one of the first things the paper mentioned, because that fireplace is the exact feature the young Billy the Kid will use as his means of escape. The sheriff, after Henry complained that the jailer was picking on him, the sheriff instructed the jailers to allow Henry half an hour a day to roam the jail outside of his cell, but in the hallways for some exercise. There was only one door, and it was of heavy oak. Well, one day, Henry was given his 30 minutes, during which time the jailer and Whitehill went into town for some business. Whitehill would later say, quote, "And right there is where we fell down, for the kid had a mind whose ingenuity we knew not of at that time." End quote. When the sheriff and his man returned, the building was empty. Whitehill would later say of the incident, quote, "When we returned and unlocked the heavy oaken doors of the jail, the kid was nowhere to be seen." End quote. He would recount, quote, "I ran outside around the jail, and a Mexican standing on a ridge at the rear asked whom I was hunting. I replied in Spanish, 'A prisoner.' He came out the chimney," answered the Mexican." End quote. The sheriff then, quote, "ran back into the jail and looked up into the big, old-fashioned chimney, and sure enough, he could see where, in an effort to obtain a hold, Henry's hands had clawed into the thick layer of black soot which lined the sides of the flue. The chimney hole itself did not appear as large as my arm, and yet the lad squeezed his frail, slender body through it and gained his liberty." End quote. After the breakout, Henry was covered in soot and blackened as if he'd just performed one of his minstrel shows from a few months prior. But what did he do? Well, the opposite of what any normal outlaw on the run would do. He stayed nearby, which is also a repeated theme of the famed escape artist and future murderer and outlaw. But again, you can't really blame him. He was only 15. Henry went directly for the Truesdale's home. This was the home of the woman who watched over Catherine when William Antrim had abandoned the family. It was the same woman whom Henry briefly lived with after his mother died. And it was the same woman who vowed to watch over Catherine's 2 children once she had passed. Miss Truesdale washed Henry and his clothes. She let him stay there that night, and then sent him off the following morning with some money and good wishes. Henry was now headed for Clifton, Arizona on a stagecoach. He was going to go see his stepfather, William Antrim. Clifton was only 100 miles away, just across the Arizona border. And that is where William Antrim had been mining instead of taking care of his 2 adopted sons. There are many conflicting stories about what happened in Clifton between the two once Henry had arrived. One story has it that Antrim gave Henry all his money. The other story that I see as most plausible, the other story is that he shunned him and said, quote, "If that's the kind of boy you are, get out." End quote. So either his stepdad helped him or he turned him away. It ain't known which way it went, but Henry didn't stay long. It is a shame, though. The man had known the boy for 11 years. Granted, he may not be his real father, he probably was not. But he could have been a father figure right here. He could have helped him, not just by giving him money, but he could have helped him and taken him to Silver City, so maybe he wouldn't get in too much trouble. Instead, he essentially, by doing nothing, or even by giving him all his money, he furthered along Henry's career as an outlaw. A career, Sheriff Whitehill said, Henry had now commenced in earnest. So at 15, Henry was alone and on the run. His plan, if he had one, was to steer clear of Silver City. So he headed west, deeper into Arizona. His whereabouts at this period are pretty much unknown, but he was certainly in southern Arizona, probably working at a ranch and using his knowledge of Spanish and his ability to read and write to his advantage. I read he was a cowhand at the Sierra Bonito Rancho, but apparently he was fired for being too small and unfit for hard labor, which I would believe. By March of 1876, though, Henry had found himself at Camp Goodwin. And Camp Goodwin was just on the east side of the San Carlos Apache Reservation, a place listeners know quite well. Camp Goodwin was actually used as a sub-agency for the reservation. Well, one day, a soldier stopped by the station on his way from Fort Grant. Now, Fort Grant is not Camp Grant, but Fort Grant, as I have described before, is just north of modern-day I-10 and northeast of Tucson. It's also not very far from Clifton. Well, this soldier spoke with the young Henry, and knowing Henry as I do, he was probably cordial and funny and witty. At least right up until the soldier turned around and had his horse stolen by Henry. Just add another crime to the list. Henry and the stolen horse then roamed through the desert and around the mountains to just outside of Fort Grant, to a place known as Milton McDowell's Mercantile. It was really a small town, and it was around Fort Grant. It had gambling halls, saloons, a blacksmith shop, whorehouses for the soldiers and miners, and anyone interested, really. It's here at 16 years old that Henry McCarty, despite his stepfather abandoning him, although we don't really know what happened in that conversation, but here Henry changed his name to Henry Antrim. But most everyone around the fort was already calling him Kid, which makes him the second Wild West character that I've covered called Kid, Billy and the Apache. Become a paid subscriber on Substack to hear the story of the Apache Kid. At McDowell's, the Kid honed his craft of gambling, and he left an impression on all of the other residents, as he always did so. The local carpenter, John Backelder, remembered him as a, quote, young, light, green-looking fellow, end quote. I do not know if he actually was green-tinted. I'm kidding. He was just like a a young, inexperienced guy. The owner of the local hotel, Miles Wood, remembered him as, quote, a small fella, not weighing over 90 pounds, end quote. But not everyone liked the kid. The blacksmith, Frank Cahill, could not stand the little guy and would often pester him, bully him. He'd throw him on the ground and sit on him. He'd ruffle his hair, and he generally made life miserable for the kid whenever the two happened to be in the same room at the same time. Eventually, Cahill would take some of his own medicine, but we're not there yet. Before long, the green-looking tiny kid got in cahoots with an ex-Army private 10 years his senior. This was a Scottish man named John R. Mackey. According to the author, George R. Matthews, Mackey was, quote, currently a member of a loose-knit band of horse thieves that roamed southeastern Arizona, end quote. As Matthews points out, the fact that Henry showed up on a stolen army horse probably helped convince Mackey of Henry's potential. Mackey was not a lightweight, though. 7 months before their meeting, Henry and Mackey's meeting, Mackey had shot a man in the throat over a card game at the McDowell's gambling hall. The man that was shot survived, but both Mackey and McDowell were arrested, although later both were released when the court said they acted in self-defense. And that is despite the man who got shot being unarmed. So the pair, Mackey and Henry, as well as the others associated with them, would steal blankets and saddles from soldiers' horses while the soldiers were at the whorehouses or the gambling halls. I mean, sometimes they'd even steal the whole horse. Here is a great story from Matthew's book about this stealing of the horses. Quote, Army saddles and horses continued to disappear during the summer and into the fall. In November, a lieutenant and an army doctor, anxious to visit their favorite pleasure palace but determined not to have their horses stolen, devised a plan to foil the two brazen thieves. They used long picket ropes to tie up their horses and carried the ends of the ropes with them into a saloon at the Hog Ranch. But while Mackey talked up the two clever officers in the saloon, Kid cut the ropes from the horses and run off with them, leaving the officers holding the pieces of rope. Riding away, leading the two horses, Kid Antrim probably had a good chuckle. End all quotes. So in that quote, Matthews was quoting the owner of the Hotel de Luna, Miles Wood. Wood, the hotel owner, was soon elected as the town's Justice of the Peace. And Fort Grant's commanding officer, Major Charles Compton, he sent Wood after Henry and Mackey for all these stunts. Clearly, the Major, Compton, and the Army had had enough of these antics. Now, Wood, while being sent, he didn't go himself. He instead sent an old man constable to retrieve the boys. But upon the old man's return, the constable said he simply could not find them. Well, Wood subsequently sent him out 2 more times, so all 3 times the constable just couldn't find them. Woods suspected the constable didn't want to find him. Despite the commander of the fort ordering his men to stop visiting the whorehouses, one First Sergeant Lewis Hartman figured there was no way the 2 horse thieves were still in town after the law was called on them 3 times. So Hartman figured he might as well break the rules a little and go see his favorite girl or play his favorite game. Well, Hartman was wrong. Henry and Mackey did in fact steal his horse while he was getting his kicks. After a berating by the commander, Hartman was forced to gather a posse of 4 other soldiers. And then 5 days later, the 5 of them were in the wilderness searching for the stolen loot. These 5 soldiers headed towards Globe, which was the most likely place to sell a stolen horse. On November 25th, the soldiers received some good fortune when they just came across Henry riding the very same stolen horse, and it was outside of an illegal mining camp. This mining camp had been set up by an ex-Confederate named Charles McMillan. The mine he opened was named the Stonewall Jackson Mine, and the camp was illegal because it was on the San Carlos Apache Reservation. So, historians and researchers are not sure what happened when Hartman and his posse met up with Henry Antrim the Kid. But what did not happen was any shooting or lynching. Despite horse thieving being a punishable offense in the wilderness. So Hartman got his horse back, but Henry was not done stealing him. Before we get to that, though, it's quite possible that Henry Antrim was at this Stonewall Jackson mine camp because his stepfather, William Antrim, was there doing some mining. Although shortly after this, William Antrim would head back to Silver City. Maybe he really did not want to be associated with his horse-thieving stepson. So, as I mentioned, Henry was not done stealing horses, although he did lay low for a time in Globe. He was there with Mackie, and the two were gambling and drinking and enjoying not being arrested. But eventually, the two got restless, and on February 10th, 1877, Henry and Mackie stole 3 more Army horses at a place known as Cottonwood Springs, which was near Fort Thomas. And Fort Thomas is just north of Fort Grant, except it's on the other side of the Pinaleno Mountains, which Grant sits at the southeastern base of. So I will let Matthews describe what happened next. Quote, Captain Gilbert C. Smith, quartermaster at Fort Grant, and First Sergeant Hartman arrived at the Hotel de Luna demanding that Justice of the Peace Miles Wood arrest the horse thieves. Apparently, Wood had made no effort to apprehend Henry and Mackie in the 3 months since his constable had failed to find them at the McDowell Store settlement. After being castigated for dereliction of duty, Wood told the officers that an official complaint against the 2 thieves had to be filed before he could issue arrest warrants. The newly arrived Fort Thomas quartermaster did not know the identity of the horse thieves and was unable to provide names for the warrants. First Sergeant Hartman, however, came forward to swear out a formal complaint against Henry Antrim, alias Kid, for stealing his horse the previous November. An arrest warrant for Mackie could not be issued because Mackie was not present when Hartman recovered his horse from Henry. End quote. So finally, Wood was being forced to do something about the Kid. Although Mackie, his older horse thief friend, was going to get off scot-free. Wood immediately sent word to Lawman and Globe, who rather quickly caught up with the Kid, and they arrested him. But, of course, Henry easily escaped. He slipped away, and he embarrassed the local constable. Luckily for the law, they caught him again. But like I said earlier, the theme of escape is a regular one. Even on this second apprehension, the Kid escaped. Scared and feeling cornered, Henry the Kid, he eventually decided it would be best to put all this horse thieving behind him, and so he returned 5 horses to Fort Thomas. The aforementioned quartermaster of the fort felt that this Kid probably needed a break, so he accepted the apology and the horses, and he decided to forget the whole affair. Or as Miles Wood later wrote, quote, the matter was dropped, end quote. But with Wood himself, the matter was in fact not dropped. He was probably embarrassed at his failure to catch the kid over the previous 3 months. So for him, he was going to do what he was called upon to do in the first place. The kid made it quite easy for Wood to accomplish this too. On March 25th, Mackie and the kid just strolled right into Wood's hotel, the Hotel de Luna. They sat down in the dining room and they ordered breakfast. Wood, sensing an easy arrest, told his staff he would personally wait on the two. Here is Wood's own words of what happened next. Quote, "I told the waiter I would wait on them myself. I had the breakfast for the two placed on a large platter, and I carried it in to them. I shoved the platter on the table in front of them and pulled a 6 gun from under it and told them to put up their hands and then to go straight out the door." End quote. Pretty slick move. A shocked Henry and Mackie no doubt protested, saying the matter had been dropped. But that was only with the horses stolen from Fort Thomas, not the horse stolen from Sergeant Hartman, even though Hartman had gotten the horse back. From the hotel's restaurant, Wood and his cook marched the two men up to the Fort Grant guardhouse, and they told the men that they should be detained there until Wood could reach the sheriff. Now, as has been stated before, Henry was adept at escaping. And pretty shortly after being deposited in the fort's jail, he saw an opportunity. Henry asked the guard if he could go to the restroom at the outhouse, and the guard obliged. But on the way to the outhouse, in a move Gus from Sac or Boomhauer from King of the Hill would appreciate, Henry picked up some sand and threw it in the guard's face before bolting off towards the nearby Bonito Creek. But the kid wasn't so lucky this time. The guard with the sand in his eyes screamed that he needed help and that the prisoner was escaping. And he alerted some nearby army men or troopers, and they quickly caught him. He was lucky he didn't get shot. Wood, bewildered that the kid had briefly escaped yet again, but also happy he was caught, he had the local blacksmith, Cahill, the bully. The blacksmith Cahill gleefully made some shackles, which then got clasped to the kid's ankles. Surely, this would do the trick. Later that night, at Camp Grant, the officers and many townsfolk, including Wood and his wife, while they were all at a little soiree, some shots rang out. And then the party received the news over the origin of the shots. As Wood told the story later, quote, "The sergeant of the guard called the colonel, Major Compton, out. In a few minutes, he came in and said the kid was gone, shackles and all." End quote. Those shots had been fired at the fleeing desperado, who was only honing his skills at escaping. Wood claimed later that the kid probably had some help from some sympathetic soldiers. But why would they help the guy who's been stealing their horses? Here's how Matthews describes what most likely happened and then what happened next. Quote, "More likely, Mackie boosted Henry to the top of the 12-foot guardhouse wall, where there was a small ventilator space between the top of the wall and the roof. From there, Henry slid his slim 90-pound body, shackled legs first, over the outside edge of the wall, and dropped down to the ground. Once outside, he scuffled away from the back of the guardhouse to the creek and then almost 3 miles to Atkinson's saloon. In leg irons, it would have taken 2 hours or more to cover that distance. Along the way, Henry retrieved his horse, still tethered outside the Hotel de Luna, and led the animal into town. Outside the Atkinson saloon, bartender Tom Varley removed Kid Antrim's ankle bracelets." End quote. As you'll see, his escapes are part of his legend. Mackey seemingly gave up his law-breaking ways after he was released from the Fort Grant jail. He had no arrest warrant out for him after all. 2 years after this incident, Mackey would re-enlist in the Army way up north in Washington State. He would die in 1920 at 71 years old in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He probably had quite a few tales of his own about the wild and woolly West. The following month, April 1877, Henry had traveled all the way to Fort Thomas. Not very far. You'd think he'd want to get the heck out of Dodge, but as you'll see, that's not the way the kid worked. This fact can be frustrating at times, even if you want to see justice come down on the kid. He does eventually seem to earn it. But at the same time, of course, one cannot help but root for him. So these decisions are always puzzling. Again, Fort Thomas is just on the other side of the mountains from Fort Grant. It is not a far distance, and it can be traveled in a determined day. At Fort Thomas, or around it really, Henry was working at H.F. Sorghum Smith's hay camp. Smith gave Henry the job of quote-unquote cleaning up the camp. But it wasn't long before Henry wanted to be paid for his services. I'll let Smith, the owner of the hay camp himself, describe the scene. Quote, "He hadn't worked very long until he wanted his money. I asked him if he was going to quit. He said, 'No, I want to buy some things.' I asked him how much he wanted and tried to get him to take $10, for I thought that was enough for him to spend. But he hesitated and asked $40. I gave it to him. He went down to the post trader and bought himself a whole outfit, 6-shooter, belt, scabbard or holster, and cartridges." End quote. True to his word, the kid did indeed come back and work. At least for a time. Probably just long enough to pay back the $40. He also, not surprisingly, if you know the rest of the kid's story, but Henry would, towards the end of the summer, go back to Fort Grant. Apparently, Wood did not care, or maybe the arrest warrant had been rescinded, or maybe it's the old "if you escape from jail, you've earned it." I am not sure. But another theme throughout Henry's life is his ability to make friends and to charm people into doing things for him, or maybe not pursuing him. People genuinely seemed to like him. I mean, someone took off his leg irons, and they no doubt knew why they were on him in the first place. This happens a lot in his short and violent life. A cowboy near Fort Grant, a man named Gus Gildea, would later say that Henry always had more friends than enemies. So Henry the Kid spent many an evening back at Fort Grant, gambling and visiting the brothel and his old friends. He also ran into his old bully Frank Cahill the blacksmith. Cahill had gained the nickname in town of Windy on account of, quote, he was always blowing about first one thing then another, end quote. And that is from the oft-cited Jerry Weddle's "Antrim is my stepfather's name." So Cahill was a blowhard, and although his army records describe him as being only 5 feet and 5 inches tall, he was a, quote, large man with a gruff voice and a blustering manner, end quote. His target was frequently the puny kid, someone even smaller than he was. Maybe the only guy around who was smaller than he was. Cahill had been in the Army for 3 years in Arizona during the Apache Wars. And when he was discharged, he stuck around and continued to blacksmith near the original Camp Grant, not Fort Grant. This would be the same Camp Grant I spoke about in the Apache series, where the unfortunate Camp Grant massacre occurred. So Cahill had been nearby during the massacre. After that incident, which I go into a bit of detail about in my Apache series, after the massacre, the Army moved the post to where it is now in this story, and they renamed it Fort Grant. Well, it is now time for Cahill to take his own medicine. I will once again let Matthews tell the story in which he quotes many who were there at the time of this incident. On Friday night, August 17, 1877, Wendy Cahill harassed Kid Antrim for the last time. Henry, quote, came to town dressed like a country Jake with store pants on, shoes instead of boots, and a 6-gun stuffed in his trousers, end quote. Henry joined a poker game at George Atkins' saloon, but soon after, Cahill entered the saloon and began taunting him. Perhaps the blacksmith bragged about having put leg irons on Kid Antrim, or possibly called him a horse thief. Henry probably responded in kind. Whatever they said, their verbal exchange quickly became heated. When Cahill called Henry a pimp, accusing the teenager of being more than a bordello visitor, and Henry retorted, calling Cahill a son of a bitch, the short but burly blacksmith grabbed Henry and, according to eyewitness Miles Wood, quote, threw him down 3 times, which made the kid mad, end quote. Then Henry, quote, pulled his 6-gun, stuck it in the blacksmith's stomach, fired, and killed Cahill, end quote. Witness Gus Galdea, 23 at the time, later gave a more detailed account. Cahill, quote, threw the youth to the floor, pinned his arms down with his knees, and started slapping his face. "You are hurting me. Let me up," cried the kid. "I want to hurt you. That's why I got you down," was the reply. People in the saloon watched the two on the floor, end quote. His arms free from the elbow down, Kid Antrim, quote, started working his hand around and finally managed to grasp his .45. The blacksmith evidently felt the pistol against his side, for he straightened slightly. Then there was a deafening roar. Wendy slumped to the side as the kid squirmed free. End all quotes. The room was full, yet no one helped the kid. No one tore the bully off of him even after throwing the kid down 3 times. The kid asked to be set free and said he was being hurt. To me, the murder was self-defense. It was justified. Justice of the Peace and hotel owner Miles Wood was there, and I can understand why he didn't want to help. Yet still, no one stepped in. But conversely, no one stopped the kid from fleeing either. He leapt up on his or someone else's horse, maybe his boss, Smith, maybe a man named John Murphy, not sure, but he leapt up on a horse and he was gone. No one tried to stop him. Cahill was taken to the fort, but the doctor there couldn't save him, and he would die the following morning, but not before saying on his deathbed, quote, "I, Frank Cahill, being convinced that I am about to die, do make the following as my final statement. My name is Frank P. Cahill. I was born in the county and town of Galway, Ireland. Yesterday, August 17, 1877, I had some trouble with Henry Antrim, otherwise known as Kid, during which he shot me. I had called him a pimp, and he called me a son of a bitch. We then took hold of each other. I did not hit him, I think. Saw him go for his pistol and tried to get hold of it, but could not, and he shot me in the belly. I have a sister named Margaret Flanagan, living in East Cambridge, Massachusetts, and another named Kate Condon, living in San Francisco." End quote. With this story on the books, Wood ordered a coroner's jury, which unanimously decided that it had been, quote-unquote, criminal and unjustifiable. Well, maybe not unanimously. Wood may have felt differently. He saw the kerfuffle. He knew the kid had been tortured by the Irishman for 2 years. No doubt others in the town felt the same. Matthews makes a good point that his old partner Mackey had gotten off on his shooting, and Henry probably would have as well. But Henry, for the second time now, lit up out the scene of the crime and left Arizona for good. And this would be the last time, essentially, that he would flee after committing a crime. At least flee the territory. Surprisingly, Henry's first destination was Silver City. He immediately went to his old stomping grounds and straight to the ranch of his former employer and adopted parents, the Knights, Richard and Sarah. Much to his surprise, his old teacher, the Englishwoman Miss Richards, now married, and Miss Casey, she was there with her husband and children. Henry stayed around 2 weeks there, during which time he told his former teacher all that he had done. Silver City was an interesting choice to return to, but later statements in life say why he always stuck around. He loved the people that loved him. According to Miss Casey's daughter, quote, "My mother gave him all the cash she had in the house, voluntarily, and Billy stayed on the rest of the day, talking with Mother and telling her about his experiences. Along toward evening, he took off." End quote. So he wasn't at the Knights for 2 weeks, but he was around Silver City. And there's a story that during these 2 weeks, he went and saw his brother Joseph, but I cannot confirm if that is true or not. White Hill was still sheriff at this time, and he was still itching to rearrest Henry for the theft and the escape from jail. And White Hill was a good lawman. He often sent fugitives from Arizona back to that territory to stand trial there. Many a horse thief of Fort Grant was apprehended by White Hill and returned. Henry, by now, was both the fugitive of Fort Grant for stealing horses and killing a man, and he was a fugitive of White Hill for his actions in Silver City. Well, after 2 weeks, Henry wisely fled again for fear the law would catch up to him. But who he fled with and where he ends up will shape the rest of his short and violent life. Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest.
Came down from Alamosa, across the Rio Grande, the tracked a killer lion, lost his fear, man. First seen around El Rito, he laid a rancher down, killed the rancher's daughter, was gone out of sound. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Not much trace of man out here, the painted canyon walls, the ancient pagan hunters show the chase and fall. Now the lever action rifle and horses change the game, but their ghosts still hunt beside me, the chase still feels the same. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the hounds my father left me are ranging out of sight. I stand up in my saddle in the early morning light. I can see the good gyp circle, and I know it won't be long till the canyon rings are striking cry, the lion will be found. Purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Finds a lonely juniper to make his final stand. 3 faithful hounds lie dying, blood shining on the sand. And the good gyp leaps up in the air, as low as murder charge. My rifle cracks, a whisper late, I can feel his iron jaw. The purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. those seas is falling, the hunter and the prey. His shadow crosses lifeless bodies, where side by side we lay. And the good ship sits upon the rim, and all alone she cries, a death song for her master, killed her mighty lion. The purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Yeah, the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed